Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome what are now 324 participants, it appears to be. This is Deena, Gonzàles, Provost and Senior Vice President, welcoming you to this webinar that President McCulloh and I called last week as an opportunity for us to speak and share as much as we possibly can in this hour and 15 minutes that we have, hour and a half, set a block of time to really think through and reflect on many of the events of these past weeks. And certainly we know that some of you have additional questions that we'll be handling on the Zoom webinar chat page. It says all you can see is Marianne's name on the screen. And one of you has written that. Another is asking if this is being recorded. And I am seeing that the recording sign up at the top left is on. So if you wish to suspend the recording because of something you want to say, please let us know. And Marianne and I can find a way to confirm that that part is being not recorded. And then we'll have to remember to click the recording button back on. To the extent possible, as we said in our email, we'd like to provide this opportunity for discussion in what we know is a climate of uncertainty, and within which the latest example of racial violence against African Americans occurred, the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And we've seen national responses to that killing, to all of the additional acts of violence that have culminated in this outpouring of protest and of concern, I think, for the level of racial violence that continues to permeate in US society. I think that we want to say very little here in terms of our own remarks, just because we want this to be an opportunity for all of you to talk. We understand that you've had within your own divisions and offices different opportunities and other spaces to discuss both what's going on nationally and also what might be going on at our university by way of preparation for our return to classes. But I think taking a pause here today is really, really important as we think through the meaning of an event such as this within the broader umbrella and scope of where we are as a university dealing with a major pandemic. I think it's also important to remember, and this was my only remark, I won't say more during the course of the webinar unless it is to answer a specific question, but when we work in a predominantly white institution, PWI, that I think it's important to remember that just as African-American history, culture, and thought are woven into the very fabric of US society, right from the beginning, since 1619, when the first ship containing the first enslaved Africans arrived, and even slightly before, because there were Africans in the United States before that who arrived in different condition and circumstances. Also, I think we need to keep in mind that African Americans have been members of this society in one way or another, in one condition or another, for a very long time. And sometimes I think that history and those contributions get subsided in the course of thinking through immediate responses in a contemporary setting. I think that in the 1590s, when Africans arrived both as enslaved and indentured servants in what is now Latin America, they found ways to preserve cultural identity in a life that can only be described as violent, as certainly precarious and situational. So today's incarceration rate for African American males, many scholars of African American studies will link back to some of these earliest conditions of enslavement, that prevailed well into 1900, because the Civil War and Reconstruction in the late 19th century did not end the enslavement of African Americans. My point is this: racial violence, I think, mirrors a racist heritage, a past that has to be acknowledged, and we're doing that now almost daily, and that can be wearing. That can be very wearing. We are all, I think, victims and recipients of this heritage, and how we navigate it is important to the well-being and safety, I think, of all members of our community, African American, people of color, or not. I think it is important that we recognize that as one possibility, full of potential for us to reckon and, quote, do something, which is what I've been hearing from many of you in emails. So with that, I want to turn it over to President McCulloh to say a few things and to frame our thoughts about discussions today. As we read through your chats about emotions being raw, as some of you have outlined here, as some of you have also begun to ask the question, as we move through those emotions, what comes next? So, President McCulloh.
Thank you very much, Provost Gonzàles. I want to thank you for framing the time that we have together in the way that you have, and I also want to share with everybody who's participating how grateful we are for your willingness to come together and to really join together with us in opening up the space to share our thoughts with one another. And I think one of the challenges with Zoom, and one of the challenges with being so disconnected physically, is that even as remarkable as the technology is at allowing us to connect, it has its limitations. And so the situation is one where it's as much to allow us as members of the community to share with one another and to exchange perspective on how we're doing, how we're feeling, the kinds of issues that are with us at this time, as it may be to any effort on the Provost's part or my part to try to answer issues. Although as they emerge, we'll do our best to try to do that as well. I think that it is important to say in the context within which we have been doing our work as university, Dr. Gonzàles and I were reflecting several weeks ago on the importance of creating periodic opportunities for us to do this kind of work, to come together, and where it becomes important to provide updates where we have information or we can provide insights as to what's going on, to share that more broadly. But I think that the last couple of weeks have obviously created a very important opportunity for us to acknowledge that there is a transformational energy that is coursing through our society, and it is impacting people in very different ways, and it is affecting, I think, virtually all people, given the magnitude and the scope and the number of communities that have chosen to become engaged with the issues that were really kind of brought to the fore and catalyzed by the death of George Floyd in police custody. And the one of many observations that I have been thinking through over these last several weeks is that we are a place that has bonded itself to a mission that is committed to engaging issues of injustice, and is committed in the various ways that we attempt to do our work and to express our desires for ourselves and for our students and the relationships that we have with colleagues to try to bring issues of injustice and in this particular instance, the kinds of issues related to racism and prejudice and discrimination that have, as Provost Gonzàles said, been a part of our national history since sort of the inception of recorded history. And so I am, on the one hand, somebody who has felt a tremendous amount of energy and sadness and grief and anger and frustration around all that has brought this to the fore, while at the same time being very conscious of the fact that there are many colleagues at our institution for whom this is a daily lived reality, and for whom the work in service to addressing injustice and educating ourselves, our people, our students around issues that relate to discrimination and the traumatic impact of prejudice is also very much part of their commitment and their work. And so we are part of a work, a mission that is really committed to being an active agent in this space, and to be anything other than intentional, and allow that to be part of what it is that we are and how we see ourselves, would be to deny an important expression of what we've committed ourselves to. And so it's a time that is fraught with a tremendous amount of emotion, and we're very conscious of the fact that the entire world is really taking the opportunity that's been created by the visible evidence of continued injustice to come together and to say, can this be a force for change? Is this not an opportunity for us, even norming it to our own specific environmental circumstances, that we can, as human beings, be and become better with and to one another, and to think about the ways that we can affect the structures that perpetuate the kind of unjust practices that have been so much at the heart of this situation. We're very conscious as well that prior to this most recent national movement, as Deena and I have talked about it, people have been enduring a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety over how society is responding to COVID-19, how the economy is reacting. There are people who are very concerned, and rightfully so, about the continuation of business and their employment, and how we are supposed to manage against the face of all that is happening with this virus, and worry too about what the meaning of people kind of deciding, whether with some intention or plan or just sporadically, that they're going to just begin re-engaging with other people out in the world, and what the implications of that might be for everybody else, for us, for everything that's going on. So it's really with a recognition that this is a time that is tremendously anxiety ridden, that we thought it would be important to acknowledge that, and to create the space for us to share perspective with one another about the meaning of it, and how, as members of a work and a community, we can help one another to know how to be helpful, how to be most supportive of one another during this time. So it's really with the intent of allowing this to be an open conversation and a dialogue that we wanted to come together this morning. We would ask, if at all possible, that you consider using the Q&A function on the webinar screen to raise the observations or reflections or issues, and we'll try to do our best to make sure that those are shared. You are certainly as well welcome to use the chat feature. It can become a little bit hard to multitask between the two functions, but we can do that too. It's not a big deal. We did decide that we would record the session because we thought it would be important for our purposes to try to capture the kinds of issues that people were naming. So whether we have time to get to all of them or not, it's still important because we want to really get a sense of what's on everybody's mind. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Provost Gonzàles.
Thank you so much, Thayne, for those remarks and for being able to explain here the process. I notice on the chat page right now that a couple of people have asked if first, they cannot see other participants' questions. They want to make sure we're not duplicating efforts. So one of the things we will try to do is to recite the question, at least briefly. We may abbreviate it, and my apologies if we don't get it quite exactly in your language or get it just right as you've stated it, but we will try to repeat the question so that in the recording people will know, because the chat itself will not necessarily be posted. The other is that some people have asked if we might pause a recording if they have something to say, or if they post something on the chat page. We can certainly do that. We can pause the recording and then open it up immediately. But I would ask you if you could only, if you could refrain from doing that. It is likely better for everyone. Or if you would like us to pose the question in a particular way, and that helps us too, as you express emotions. We're not going to quote you or say your name necessarily. We'll say a person posts or someone asks. The next thing too is that if you could be careful in your posting of chats, to post maybe once or twice as we move along here, because the chat page can become incredibly long. And if you begin posting your thoughts and reflections and too much of that, that can also keep people from maybe asking questions or us from responding or finding those questions. So just be cognizant of the fact that we're reading, and we don't want to limit anyone's participation, but rather to try to kind of control it, given that we're now at 436 participants. And I think, as President McCulloh said, that in of itself is indicative of the need for us to have conversations like this. These will not be the last. There will be others that will be forthcoming from various offices and that are planned. And so we will learn more about those in the coming set of weeks. So I think that you cannot see other participants' questions. And so you're saying you want to make sure that you're not duplicating other efforts. So I think that what we can do is continue to repeat a set of questions that have come in. So President McCulloh, do you want to start with any one of the questions that you see posted right now?
So there is a question that is, I'm going to repeat the question as it was written. This incident was sparked by an event against a Black male. There are institutions in our society that are very good at recruiting and being inclusive to Black males, e.g. the military, NFL, NBA, and even our basketball program. So I'm not sure if this is a standalone statement, because the person who posted it is not identified, and there are a number of anonymous questions which are listed. It may simply be an observation, but there is a clearly there are definitive issues that relate to how different aspects of society and culture are or are not reflective of the engagement of Black males, Black people, and there are certainly, as Provost Gonzàles said, plenty of scientific aspects or evidence that would indicate that Black males are disproportionately incarcerated, disproportionately the target of the justice system. And this acknowledges that entering into and having conversations about this space is something that is fraught with, for many people, a lot of emotion, a lot of fear, and really, I think, illuminates the need for us as people, but as in this context, a university community, to really, with some organized focus, engage with each other in tough conversations, which I think can be facilitated in a very effective way, but doesn't change the fact that they can be often very uncomfortable and force us to confront some of the issues that we may be sort of generically aware of, but sometimes upon further review and evaluation, make clear that there are other aspects of the culture and dynamics that are working through our environment that are not, and somewhat intentionally, I think, not visible and not available to us, that would be important for us to be aware of and to understand and acknowledge. I do think that it is important to say that there have been efforts, intentional efforts on the part of a number of people throughout the institution to place emphasis upon ways in which we can improve and increase the attractiveness of positions within our institution to people who traditionally are underrepresented in our community, and yet at the same time, it seems to me clear that we as a university community have work to do to really come together and both understand what it is that we truly wish to embrace and why it's important for us as a community to really consider what digging in and doing the hard work of investing in the question of what we want for ourselves and what kind of a community we want to be in terms of the representation of diversity within our employee population, faculty, staff, as well as the kinds of opportunities that would make us attractive as a culture and community, not merely as an employer, to people who come to us from very, very different and varied backgrounds and ethnic experiences and populations, and would want to unite together with colleagues to do the important work that we do. And so this topic and this focus has been part of the very recent conversation that I, together with members of the cabinet, have been having about what it is that we want to commit ourselves to together with other leaders throughout our community that would really constitute a meaningful engagement around these kinds of issues. And I think it has been a very serious and in some cases a very sobering conversation, but it's one that I see colleagues as being really actually very committed to and wanting to engage and to determine what the level of seriousness within the community for engagement truly is. So I'll turn it over to you, Provost Gonzàles, for the next question.
Thank you. Mary Ann Rinderly is helping us with the webinar, and so she has just said that she can open the chat page so that you might see the questions on the chat page. So she will be doing that next. Stay tuned. And as you may know, if you don't know, the chat, the Zoom webinar chat often appears over to the right at your bottom bar on Zoom. If you click more, you can see chat. You can also see questions and answers. So we have two things going. One is the chat page itself, the chat comments and questions, and then the question and answers would appear separately. You can click on that to bring those up, and it looks like there are about 12 on the question and answers. So here are a few more that we would want to tackle and that have come through on one or the other of the two methods. One asks what the Society of Jesus has had to say about the mistreatment of the disenfranchised over the last decades, and can you recommend a Jesuit book to read on this topic? I think that on the chat page, if people could post some of the things that they have been reading, we certainly know the work of people like Jim Martin working with LGBTQ communities within the society, but also within the Catholic Church. There are a lot of books also by people like Father Greg Boyle, down at Homeboy Industries down in Los Angeles, and there are many others. If you subscribe to the feed or the list, the web page and conversation page called, I think, America Media, that will bring up a number of current Society of Jesus Jesuit writings, and it also keeps you kind of up to date on some of the things that the Pope and or the Vatican and others have been posting. So think if we can help one another with those sources, that would be terrific. And then we have a question that I think President McCulloh may also want to tackle from someone who asks about this very important discussion in relationship to the responses that constituents may have and donor relations, in particular when our budget is impacted by a pandemic. The question has to do with balancing action and public statements that acknowledge what we have said about GU being bonded to a mission that is committed to engaging issues of injustice and the impact that that might have. So if you could tackle that one, Thayne, thank you.
I think as I read the question, if I'm reading it accurately, the question is pointing at what might constitute a little bit of a dilemma or a conundrum. That though the question, as it's been framed, does not explicitly say this, there's an acknowledgement behind the question that an awful lot of the issues that are really truly significant that are moving through our society often become, whether they are ever intended to, whether they're even really designed for this, they often become politicized. There has even been politicization around how individuals might respond to COVID-19 in appropriate or effective ways. And when you enter that space, and the temptation, I think, may be that sometimes people are quick then to move into the space of really trying to kind of label and categorize. It becomes a question as to whether or not you want to come boldly out with a significant statement on an issue because it may serve to offend or to in some way disaffect people who aren't in agreement with you. And indeed, the truth is that as over the last decade or so that I've been in this office, and on occasion have issued statements on matters that have been really important, and I think in many cases might have been perceived as bold, but in my view, very consistent with Catholic social teaching, with the mission of our institution, as we've stated it, with social justice, mission-oriented activities. People have sometimes responded very negatively to those. And so it is the case that people will not always agree, particularly when a symbolic leader makes a statement on an issue that they consider to be controversial, or when, as often is the case, you make a statement and it doesn't address every single facet of what is truly a very complex and challenging issue to try to address. But candidly, while I always try to place the concerns of our students and our own community first, as I'm thinking about how it is that we might respond or speak on a particular issue, I have over time become aware that our job is to state our truth as we see it, to recognize that that is always going to be limited by experience, and that there are always going to be additional things that one could have further said or commented upon, but that being consistent and true to the principles that are guiding us is also really important. And that in many cases, what has happened when we've come out strongly on a particular matter and people have reacted, it actually creates the opportunity to engage in further conversation, especially if those people are very invested in the institution and very invested in the welfare of our students. So we often have a lot of follow-on conversations with people that perhaps unsurprisingly, but importantly, often result in a deeper sense of understanding and awareness of what it is that we're trying to do, and an appreciation that at the core of what it is that we're doing are these values that we believe in what we're doing, and we believe that it's important for us to be consistent. So I guess I would say I don't worry over much about the issues related to how particular donors may or may not feel, and am much more concerned about whether this constitutes an opportunity for us to do really important constructive work on behalf of our students, on behalf of those who are working with and serving our students. So that's been my approach. And you know, I'm sure that I'm confident there are people who have said, well, if that's where you're at, I'm out. I'm not interested anymore. But there are also people who often show up as a result of us saying things too. So it goes both ways.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of other questions that have to do with employees and working within an environment that is predominantly white, dealing with whiteness, white privilege, and the roles that those play. How are we committed to engaging those employees in the issues widely, boldly, and with urgency, and the burden of education not being placed exclusively on people of color? The other piece to this down below, there's another question that says, what kinds of institutionalized mechanisms are there for staff training and multicultural competence? Because so much of that tends to be limited to lunch hours or evening hours. And so how can anti-racist behavior be a clear expectation for all employees? There are a couple of things here that are important to me. One, in these questions, so thank you for raising them. One is that there are a number of changes at Gonzaga, even in the last 24 months, if we look carefully at some of the things that have been institutionalized. For example, President McCulloh and the cabinet and the board of trustees all agreed to an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion that would be standing on its own and be fully staffed. And that office will have, effective July 20th, 3 full-time people dedicated to this work in diversity, equity, and inclusion for the institution. So that's a very important commitment. It was an important step. It fulfills a number of the ideals of the mission in creating spaces for equity and for inclusion in particular, and in conducting programming. And that office has been very busy this past academic year, pulling in new resources, a survey, creating a space for people to take a webinar and be led through a process of acknowledging white privilege and whiteness, and also racism and racist tendencies in the society. So it's both a learning module, has learning components, and it's also a way of opening up a space for discussion and dialogue, so that the more questions asked, the more conversation and thought can, I think, be deepened through that process. We also, of course, have the Institute for Hate Studies that Dr. Christine Hoover directs, and they have been hard at work, not just with their journal, but in planning activities and talks. We have had a number of star speakers on the campus, but we've also had, in addition to people like Patricia Cullors this from Black Lives Matters this spring, and Kimberly Crenshaw last spring, we've also had people who come onto the campus to do workshops. So Mary James was here and had an enormous impact and touched the lives of a number of people regarding curricular adaptations, places to start to adjust a curriculum to include questions of race. And then, in addition to all of this, also within the last 24 months, really, is the creation of a department, Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, which welcomed 2 new faculty who have been incredibly busy, not only setting up a curriculum, but also creating partnerships across the campus. And in the short time the 2 have been here, 10 minors have already signed up for the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies minor. And that was back in March or April when I had an update, so I'm sure there are more there. So these elements all contribute. They don't necessarily fully address the idea of employees or staff having a place to go. But I think with the partnerships that Dr. Raymond Reyes, as head of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office, is creating with human resources, as well as with mission and ministry, you will begin to see more programming that is calendared and that gives you some opportunities to immerse yourself in some of the latest discussions, given that so many of you work very long hours across the week and do not necessarily have time to continue to become informed or to be informed and remain informed. And things do change quickly. If you notice just the introduction of certain terms like PWI, predominantly white institutions, has never in my 30-some years in the professoriate and the career in higher education been a common term. And yet now we are beginning to use it. So I recognize that it takes us all time to become practiced in some of these conversations, and that we sometimes hesitate to say things for fear of feeling like we're underinformed. But I think there are ways on the campus for us to continue to remain informed and to make it a priority, in fact, to be informed about race matters. So President McCulloh, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I was just going to add one piece because I think you did a great job, Deena, on this question. I would just share with you that I think as we were having conversation at Cabinet last week, I was referencing in my own mind conversations that have been occurring in a lot of different circles, both within the institution and outside of it. And of course, because of everything that has been occurring and because there's no community, of which I am aware that is not talking about, engaged in some way, active, in the conversation. A lot of people are now having conversations, and I shared that I think one of the greatest fears that those who care passionately about these issues have is that this as emergent and as tremendous the amount of energy and activism as this has engendered is going to be over, and it's going to fade into the distance, and once again will be part of this sort of enormous relic pile of instances where people said really important things and then nothing happened. So how do we keep this conversation alive, and how do we really think about the ways in which we can use this as an opportunity to integrate some of this into the work that we're doing and into the conversations that we're having and the planning that we're doing, not only in those specific areas of the institution that are designated or identified as having a particular responsibility for creating or facilitating, but throughout the institution. And one of the things I think we can do and we should do is to consider as individuals how to become more educated and more literate about these matters, so that there is an opportunity to begin having engaged dialogue that is not immediately fraught with defensiveness and fraught with fear. An example, I'll screen share this just for a moment, is that there's actually quite a literature that's been developed specifically in order to facilitate conversations among groups. Doesn't have the answers necessarily, but certainly to create the kind of framework or space that allows people, having done some self-work, to begin engaging. And this is part of a tradition that our colleagues in DEI and UMEC and DICE and other areas are very, very familiar with, that having opportunities to first provide people with self-reflective time to think intentionally about these issues as a forefront to then an engaged conversation, even if it's just one-on-one or in small groups, is sometimes a really impactful experience, and it really elevates our ability to be more comfortable about engaging tough and very, very emotional issues. But I think if we fail to do those kinds of things, we're going to be stuck in the same place that so many university communities and other organizations find themselves.
Thayne, I also see a number of questions about whether we are considering revising our relationship with the Spokane Police Department. And that's been asked in several different ways here, but there is a sense of the need to talk about that. So I'm wondering if you might say something. I would like to know how Gonzaga is working on supporting students who are on campus now, and the person opens that comment with that they were shocked to hear about the staging of police bomb squad vehicles near Kennedy last week. So I think a little further explanation about what those vehicles were, the intention, the arrangement, and relationship might be helpful.
Yes, and the situation at Kennedy presented itself as an opportunity in right here in our own locale to begin kind of delving into the space that, though just downtown, might otherwise have remained a little bit more remote. So I'm very conscious of, and have also been doing some initial thinking about this same area. So just I am aware. I think everyone probably saw my message about what occurred with the SPD and the Kennedy apartments, and really what in some ways to me also represented some miscommunication, which was itself unfortunate and itself is a area of focus. But I did have some engaged conversation with the director of our campus security and public safety department, and am aware of the fact that traditionally and historically, the university has had a very engaged relationship with the Spokane Police Department. The Logan neighborhood is a neighborhood that is inhabited by a large number of our students on a regular and an itinerant basis. And it also happens to be the case that there are crimes that occur in the neighborhood. And the Spokane Police Department relies heavily on campus security to be eyes and ears in the neighborhood, which is just a small geographical region compared with the metropolitan area they're responsible for. And many of the incidents and issues that occur in the neighborhood are, in terms relative to many of the issues that SPD deals with, considered to be lower priority. But they're very high priority for our students and for their families. And so depending upon the circumstances, there has been, out of a need and a desire to try to be responsive to the security concerns and the safety issues related to the neighborhood, a very close interactive relationship with SPD. And that relationship goes back a long ways. There are former officers of the SPD who serve on and have served on campus security. There are relationships that we've had as an institution, even to the efforts of SPD under the auspices of Mayor Condon to initiate a review of use of force with the chairing of a commission that at the time it was appointed was chaired by Marty Martin, who is our former executive vice president and former dean of the law school. So there's a lot of interrelationships on a number of different levels with SPD, and there has been historically an agreement to try to cooperate back and forth in terms of a commitment to trying to do the best work possible, trying to assist one another. This circumstance is something that is going to place law enforcement in all of its expressions under a pretty significant magnifying glass. And we're conscious of the fact that the officers who serve on SPD and our own campus security officers are extremely aware of and very, very sensitive to and concerned about the implications of trying to kind of navigate in this space and time. It is the case that Spokane itself has had incidents where individuals have been killed by officers of the SPD, and that was what catalyzed the use of force commission and the review. And it is the case that a disproportionate number of those who have suffered injury and who have died are represented by Black men. So the thought or the idea that this is a remote issue and that there's absolutely no indication whatsoever that this is something that Spokane should not be paying attention to or concerned about it is on its face an illusion. It's something that needs to be understood, and it's something that requires attention. What our institutional role in relationship to that work needs to be is something that I think we have to ask, and we have to think carefully about. It is with ultimately always with the goal of trying to animate the work that goes on in our community, the relationships that we have with our mission values, that we would seek to consider that question, because it is absolutely the case that we can look at and examine this particular phenomenon, and we're obligated to do that. It is also a concern that has been expressed to me directly, that the challenge associated with this moment is that it does not serve to recognize certain circumstances or instances where members of the law enforcement community have been vital to the support and the protection and addressing concerns as well of members of the community, and that in this moment, perhaps that really should not be where we place our emphasis. But there is this concern, again, expressed directly to me, that there's a temptation to take things in such a way that it doesn't acknowledge the contributive and the constructive work that some members of the force are also really trying to do and committed to, and that is a disservice to those who really eschew the violence and some of the unethical and inappropriate practices that can occur within the jurisdiction of law enforcement. So I think speaking truthfully to the issues that we're trying to manage and wrestle with, by really taking the time to understand where the issues are and how they're playing themselves out is important, but it cannot serve as a delay or an excuse for not looking at the issues and really examining carefully the question of how it is that we are supposed to be in relationship, whether it's specific with our own interactions with SPD, or whether it's broadly as a member of a concerned community that is having the attention brought to it around these issues.
We have another set of questions about the students, and thank you all for raising this as well, as we keep the students in mind, both because they're not quite yet with us, all of them, and also because we know they're returning. You're asking, how do we create a space for the student body to share their desires about how Gonzaga would like to respond to the recent events of police brutality against the Black community and persons of color? Might we invest efforts? And the answer to that is that yes, the president and I have on our agenda next to meet with students. We're meeting with staff. We met with faculty a few weeks ago, and probably have to do another meeting with faculty to catch up, because that was before the George Floyd protests and demonstrations took off. So we have a number of things that we will continue to do in terms of creating the communication and keeping the communication flowing through our offices and also to the communities that we're all a part of. Relatedly, some of you ask, when might we start organizing in-person community work with safe distancing with students and coworkers to fight for racial equity? And I think that's also an extremely important question, because I know that many of you have ideas, and there are ideas that will stem and come from the programming that the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office will begin doing. They've posted, for example, that they have a series, a podcast series called Intercultural Yoga, and they're saying that the conversations from that will begin, and they will announce it in morning mail. So just so that all of you know, there are things being planned specifically for the community, and then for the students. I don't know, Thayne, if you want to add a bit to that about the return of students, but also when we might anticipate communicating with them as well.
So I want to reel back just for a moment and say that that it has been important to me in this context as well to reach out to individual students that I know, Black students, students of color, and also to the president of the Black Student Union in an effort to both show support and to engage around a deeper awareness and understanding of how these recent events are landing on them as individuals and how they're trying to kind of work through them, and whether there are specific ways that we as a university can be of support, and again to engage around the question of how we can be involved together with them in using this as an opportunity to be a better community, to really take the energy and to try to continue to move forward in the development of our own culture around issues of prejudice and racial bias and discrimination, which our students fairly consistently represent do occur. And sometimes it's very overt, and sometimes it's very subversive, but nonetheless are clearly in the experience of many of our students extant and need attention. So as we continue to do the work of planning for reopening, we will also continue to engage with various circles and broader circles of our students, as well as our faculty. With respect to reopening, Deena, are you referring specifically to re-engagement in view of COVID-19?
I think the question comes through COVID-19, but it really is about how can we continue this work for racial equity together, in-person community work. So the question is coming from someone who wants to, I guess, participate or organize or help organize in-person community work, and so with students specifically.
Yeah. Well, and in this regard, I think there's a number of different approaches, and there's a question that's come in that's certainly related to this as well, wherein somebody has shared that that they don't feel equipped to necessarily engage some of these conversations themselves, and yet they want to facilitate and support the engaged discussion around these issues, and are kind of looking for advice and thoughts around how that's something that as a supervisor they might be better supported in. We are fortunate, in my view, to have a core group of colleagues, both on the faculty and also on the staff within administration, for whom this is their commitment, this is their work. They're incredibly thoughtful and very well informed about various approaches that individuals might be willing to take, ranging from really formal inventory-based work to more informal, engaged, conversational and facilitated discussion type work. But I would really encourage us to interconnect with our colleagues in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, because they themselves are able to certainly support, but they also are interconnected with many of the colleagues who in turn might, by virtue of the specific set of issues or the particular vantage point that they bring, be better positioned to work in a specific area, or might be recommended for that. So I do believe that it's important that we depend on and turn to colleagues who are expert and practiced to help, and to also help coordinate our institutional response, because that way it becomes more visible and known. But by no means is that one office the only place or space that's doing important work. And so, as I say, part of their work is to be interconnected with other colleagues who are engaged in this space, so that the sort of full wealth of who we have in the campus community can be brought to bear in these spaces and places. But I would say further, I do think that this moment is obligating us to more broadly and more deeply engage in the question of how we as university might best wish to engage these issues to increase our own capabilities in terms of being capable of engaging, in particular, with our students and with our colleagues on these really important issues, and really bring all of that to bear on the question of their experience. What is it that we want for them while they're here? What is it that we want them to take away from this out of their education? And so this is very much an issue that I think we as university community have an opportunity in a renewed sense to make some determined efforts to try to invest in. And I think that would be a tremendous legacy to what it is that's been happening for us, if we can take another step in the direction of truly living out the meaning of our mission.
There are a few questions also coming from you on the chat pages that have to do with resources. I just want to remind you that people have posted the AJCU.net racial violence hyperlink on there, so that you might get to that address. Matthew Barkas has also reminded people there are a few other statements that have emerged, and it might be important in mission and ministry. In an email on 5/29, there were a list of Catholic and Jesuit resources that you all might find helpful. And then there are a few others that have to do with reading the Bible, apparently, is something that one person or several people feel might be important. And then a question thing that I think is important as well, and this might be weaving a couple of things together in a way that is a little bit complex or complicated, because different people, particularly staff, employees, workers at the university, occupy different sectors and areas of the university, and might not always be in conversation or fully knowledgeable and aware of what's going on in other sectors, because of particular projects that require immersion for what seem to be months at a time. Mm-hmm. But here's one about mandatory training for employees, similar to IT security training. And Other institutions have mandatory training on discrimination, harassment, intellectual property. I know that having taken some of those trainings myself for search committees, for example, anyone who's a member of a search committee must take a training that HR organizes. And those are very well run and managed and provide a lot of opportunity for discussion and questions and answers. I found them to be very useful in learning how Gonzaga conducts searches. So that's one place, but it doesn't quite get at the whole notion of mandatory training for employees that I think probably Vice President Jim Angelasanti and others will be interested in hearing about as one suggestion coming out of this conversation. And then the other question, Thayne, has to do with is more academic, but again, because many staff do serve as adjunct faculty or teach courses, because there are also courses taught co-curricularly in student affairs, in the Division of Student Affairs and Student Development. There is some interest about how and what types of classes are offered, and a question that I think is very important, falling under the entire discussion of diversity itself, taught by white faculty. Classes that would fall under diversity are often taught by white faculty and are very much geared towards white students. So not necessarily a place for students of color who may feel threatened or embarrassed. The exception, of course, CRES, where students of color are being, many courses there are being taught by faculty of color. And there's some concern about whether these courses can be designated and so on. And I can already hear all of the issues that might be raised on the faculty side of things about such a component, who's teaching what, when, how sensitive, how well trained is a faculty member in offering such courses. And all of these are things that I know our students of color grapple with, as well as our faculty of color. So I think the important thing there too is that with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, one of my hopes is that faculty will continue to engage in those difficult conversations about how they might contribute and partner to creating a curriculum that really allows students to both have agency by choices, but also at the same time lets our students know that part of the Gonzaga undergraduate experience, minimally, is that they emerge being conversant in issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I've bundled up a couple of things there, but I don't know, President McCulloh, if you would like to comment.
I think one thing I would want to go back to is this issue of mandatory. The truth is that I personally believe that there are certain things that we should obligate ourselves to, but the spirit behind it should be reflective of what we have chosen to commit ourselves to as institution. And often when we can articulate what we're committing ourselves to and in service in turn to what, it changes what otherwise sometimes ends up feeling like it's getting framed as a command and control kind of dynamic. And so what I'm pointing to in part is that we have been blessed this year with the inclusion of Dr. Charlita Shelton in the DEI office, who together with Dr. Raymond Reyes and their colleagues went and really searched for and evaluated whether or not there might be any tools that would be particularly valuable or useful or helpful in terms of allowing people the opportunity to engage around issues of diversity and cultural fluency. And there is an organization called diversity.edu that has a tool which they selected and they offered in a pilot phase to a number of colleagues, which was very well received, in part because it sort of pushes back on the question of diversity training as a frame, and some of the implicit assumptions that come with training, which is that there's people who know, and there's people who don't know, and there's people who need to know, and how do we get people informed and on board, as opposed to more of a appreciative inquiry perspective that sort of says, look, in order to be current and contemporary and to be facile at engaging with our students, with our colleagues, we have to appreciate that this is a space that continues to evolve, and that there is every year there are new perspectives and there's new ways of approaching our understanding of these really incredibly important but also very complex issues. And so thinking about who we are as cultured individuals as an expression of our development, our ongoing development, and that really becoming more and more educated about these things is about being better positioned to be effective in our work, and to be effective in interfacing with students, and to be effective at mediating conflict when it arises, or being better positioned to know how to respond, is really sort of the objective of this module. And I've asked Charlita and I've asked Raymond if they would be willing to expand the reach of this as a resource for all of us, so that more people can have an opportunity to access it, and to have the experience of what moving through the modules affords them as opportunity. So there absolutely are some of the fundamental building blocks, or the elements that could become, whether we mandate it or whether we sort of agree to assume the obligation ourselves as committed members around these issues, opportunities to do this work. And that, I think, is very important because the space continues to, as I say, develop and evolve. And it's not a thing, it's a process, and it's an experience of education that I think it is actually quite important for us to take seriously. So we'll continue to think about strategies or approaches that we might undertake to try to see how supportive members of the community really are around engaging these issues, and then have the resources and tools in a variety of forms that allow people to do the work.
I think also, Thayne, one of the things that I'm seeing are a whole range of suggestions. I'm very conscious of the fact that we're close to our ending time, but I did want to point out that people have, for example, explained that they think that we do very well with Gonzaga students on matters of privilege, racism, classism, sexism, by way of intergroup dialogue that's offered through the Office of DICE. And so we equip students, they equip students there to think about how you dismantle systemic racism and oppression, and lend them tools, but maybe we're less able to create the same kind of toolkit in the work that we do with staff and faculty assemblies. And so that might be a place to turn for some training. There's another question related to procurement and purchasing processes, which also I think is very important. That this reflect and support the BIPOC, people of color communities, and do we have certain percentages from companies? And so that is something, a suggestion and an idea too, that we can take and examine more closely. There is interest in that, and Cabinet certainly has talked a bit about it, so we can pursue it. You also mentioned, I know the student development mentions that they have and are planning a number of programs and activities that are designed for student interactions and also that are division-wide staff sessions that have readings and discussions with students and leadership training components. We know all of that work goes on, but I think that when we hit a time or a period like this, where there is an incident of racial violence, where there is something that happens, and we then see the pattern emerging far more clearly than anyone could ever imagine or even hide from, we then try to reach and search for these tools that will help us make sense, you know, even in our daily lives, what can be helpful, what can be done. And there were a number of things this weekend. I mean, on the South Hill, there was a caravan of cars that came through honking Black Lives Matter signs on the cars. I stood outside of my front yard and clapped and waved, and I think that was appreciated. I didn't see a lot of my neighbors doing that, but I think maybe they either were not home or they didn't know, or maybe they were participating in the caravan. There are small things I think we can do, and then there are big things. And then there are also invisible things, like the way we institutionalize this conversation and carry it on inside of our offices, inside of our programming and our events. So I think that being mindful and being, having the questions raised and the opportunity to really, you know, think about these things collectively is just one step. As we know, the important thing comes in the implementation. As you all know, I'm new to Gonzaga this year. I now feel a little bit older than I did when I arrived, and began the work last February and then fully on board on June 3rd. I have learned a lot about the institution, and I find myself very proud of being associated with a university that names its values, that understands its mission, that can speak to its mission, and that also understands it has a ways to go, it has work to do. I think that's the mark of an institution that is growing and flourishing. When we can recognize with one another that we do have a lot of growth ahead of ourselves, we have tools, we have one another to be able to help us. There was a question posed here about what are you doing specifically to hire the most underrepresented groups? I can tell you we all individually, at least on the cabinet, the president, and many members of the Board of Trustees are asking ourselves that question almost daily. What are we doing? And we have specific responses, we have specific techniques, we have ideas, we have things we do that are invisible to a great many people, but that I can assure you are going on. We ask one another, why is this pool of finalists not diverse? What has happened here? Why is this description worded the way that it is? Could it be worded to invite more diversity into the pool? Each of us are tackling this, and I can assure you it is a top priority for me. I know it is a top priority for the president. It has been enacted as a priority at Gonzaga for quite a long time, and perhaps we just need to remind each other that this is ongoing work and that it is significant and important work. So President McCulloh, do you have final words? And thank you.
I thank you, Dr. Gonzàles, and it's not definitely not the final word by any means, but I would share this as well. One of the beautiful things about Gonzaga and one of the challenging things about Gonzaga is that we are an incredibly dynamic environment. Dr. Raymond Reyes and I have talked about this over time. We bring a new generation of students into ourselves, as it happens, virtually sometimes now on campus, but we bring a new generation every year. And with that new generation come individuals who are eager and hopeful, and they are possessed of their own evolved biases and in attitudes. And so the work of continuing to animate their experience with an awareness of these issues and how we as university wish to engage these issues is it is perennial work. It is work that will never end, because the dynamic of our community is one that they as students, much less we as employees, come to the place in new and different ways every year. And we find ourselves sometimes having the same conversation that we did 10 years ago around many of the same issues, merely as a function of that dynamic. We are not a static organization where we have the ability to capture ourselves and freeze ourselves in a moment of time. That having been said, I am extraordinarily grateful for the efforts that so many colleagues have made over time to try to meaningfully impact this community, to increase the diversity of our student population, to work so diligently to support our students of color and those who have been marginalized by society merely on the basis of their skin color, and to help them to gain for themselves the opportunity that this education is intended to provide for people who have decided that they don't want to be on the sidelines. They want to be part of meaningful change. And whether that is something that has been more recent or something that's always been a part of their work, it all matters. It all makes a difference. And so I'm very grateful to everybody who joined together with us this morning, because I think that itself is an indication of the degree to which people care about these issues. And we do want to have these conversations. We want to try to create the space where we acknowledge as an institution all that Provost Gonzàles said, both about who we are and what we want for ourselves, and also the distance we have yet to go. So to you, Provost Gonzàles, I want to say thank you for opening up this space, and for all of you who joined. We will capture the Q&A and the chat, and find some way to keep a record of that for our ongoing discussions. There are some things we didn't get to, we know that, but they're all really good questions and issues that I think are great ways of understanding where those who chose to weigh in with a question or comment can help us understand what you're concerned about, what is on your mind. And so for those, and for any other questions or comments you might want to share with us privately, I think I will speak for myself in saying I am very interested to know more about what's on your mind, more about what this time may have generated for you, and how we can support one another to really use this as an opportunity and a springboard into further work together. So thank you.
Thank you. I think that concludes our session. We will have, someone asks if we might have the lists that were posted on the chat page of resources and hyperlinks. And yes, we can do that. I've just copied most of it. There's another suggestion, Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, is a really important one. I don't know if we've had Ibram Kendi come to the campus, but that might be another possibility as well in the coming year. We also have a number of other resources and books that people are reading. Crystal Fleming has written that very popular book that Temple University wrote, or published, I'm sorry, about the race and questions, about, is there a stupid question one asks on race? And it's written in a very conversational style. So I think that we have a number of things that we can call upon and that are available at our library. And if you're not able to purchase them, can also be linked through your library account for reading and downloading onto a Kindle or just onto your devices. So we will continue the conversation. And I just want to thank again everyone who participated. I know we have other things we've got to attend to and move to on to different meetings, but you have taken a part of your time, a part of your morning, and made this an important piece of our own community building and our own also action to learn more and to be more. And that as our Majis explains, that I think is an important piece to all of our forming community. So thank you for being attentive and for asking such incredible questions that we will take ourselves and use in these next weeks ahead. Be safe, be healthy. Thank you.